A senator from the Deep South leaned over to the man beside him and whispered something that would later be repeated in every political backroom from Washington to Nashville. He said the night J.D. Vance walked into that ballroom, the old Republican Party walked out, not with a roar, not with a fight, but with the slow, quiet dignity of a man who finally understood he no longer belonged. What happened in that ballroom in the heart of Washington was not just a confrontation between two former political allies. It was a reckoning. It was the settling of an ancient, unspoken debt. And the man who came to collect it did not come with fury. He came with something far more dangerous. He came with the truth. There are moments in the life of a nation that feel, even as they are happening, like something that has already been carved into stone. The air itself seems to recognize them. The light bends differently. The silence between words carries more weight than the words themselves. What unfolded in the grand federal ballroom on that particular evening was one of those moments. No speechwriter had designed it. No political consultant had mapped it out on a whiteboard. It erupted from the raw, unresolved tension of a movement that had been building for years. Tension between two visions of what it meant to lead, what it meant to serve, and most devastatingly, what it meant to betray. The event had been billed as a celebration, a gathering of the conservative movement's most powerful names, its most generous donors, its most influential voices. The Federal Capitol Gala was the kind of event where fortunes were pledged over filet mignon, where the architecture of the next election cycle was sketched on cocktail napkins. Crystal chandeliers cast their fractured light over a room full of people who believed, with the unshakable certainty of the powerful, that they were the ones who decided the future. The tables were dressed in deep navy and gold. Flowers that had been flown in from Colombia perfumed the air with a sweetness that felt almost incongruous with the hard, angular world of politics that hummed beneath the surface of every polite conversation. Somewhere near the back, a string quartet played something classical and forgotten, a melody that no one truly heard but whose absence would have been noticed. Vice President J.D. Vance had arrived early, as was his habit. Not the theatrical early of a man performing punctuality for cameras, but the genuine, purposeful early of someone who wanted to read a room before it filled. He had moved through the pre-event reception with the quiet, contained energy of a man who understood that he was always being watched, always being measured, and who had long since made peace with that reality. He shook hands firmly. He listened more than he spoke. He had a particular way of tilting his head when someone was talking to him, a slight inclination forward that communicated genuine attention, that said without words that whatever you were saying to him was the only thing in the world that mattered in that precise second. People noticed it. It made them feel, in a city full of people who specialized in the performance of listening, that they had actually been heard. Mike Pence was already seated at a table near the front when Vance arrived. They had exchanged the formal, careful nod of two men who share a complicated history and have silently agreed to keep its full weight locked away, at least for the evening. Pence had been dressed impeccably, as always, his silver hair perfectly arranged, his American flag pin catching the chandelier light on his left lapel. He looked like what he had always looked like, a man assembled by central casting to play the role of a Midwestern conservative statesman. Every angle of him was deliberate. Every element of his presentation whispered credibility, trustworthiness, gravitas. He was a human press release that had spent 50 years perfecting itself. But there was something different about him tonight. Those who knew him well, who had spent years reading the subtle weather systems of his expression, might have caught it. A certain tightness around the jaw. A quality of stillness that was not calm but contained. The stillness of a man who has rehearsed something so many times it has begun to feel inevitable. He nursed a glass of water and spoke with the small cluster of donors at his table with the polished ease of a man who has made small talk a professional art form. But his eyes, behind their practiced warmth, were somewhere else entirely. They kept drifting, just slightly, toward the front of the room, toward the podium. The program had been arranged with the choreographic precision of a state dinner. Opening remarks from the party chairman, a video tribute, several speakers of ascending importance, and then the centerpiece, Vice President J.D. Vance, who would deliver what was being called a major address on the future of conservative governance. Trump himself had concluded the keynote 20 minutes prior, leaving the room in the particular state of electrified reverence that only he could generate, a combination of adrenaline and spectacle that left people slightly dazed, as if they had been too close to something very loud and very bright. The applause for Trump had been seismic. It was the applause of true believers, the kind of sound that comes from the sternum rather than the palms. It took a full 3 minutes to subside, and even then it lingered in the room like the afterimage of a lightning flash, visible in the flushed faces and the shining eyes. The chairman had returned to the stage, signaled for order, and begun the brief and formal introduction of the vice president. J.D. Vance had risen from his seat at a table near the side of the room. He straightened his jacket in a single, unhurried motion. He did not appear to steel himself or take a preparatory breath. He simply stood, the way a man stands when he is entirely comfortable in his own body, in his own mind, in his own purpose. He had begun to walk toward the stage. The room was already settling into an attentive hush, the soft mechanical sound of microphone adjustments filling the transitional silence. He was 6 feet from the podium when the voice came. It was not a shout. It was not meant to be. It was the kind of voice that does not need volume to command attention, because it has spent decades learning exactly how to modulate itself for maximum impact. It had the cold, premeditated clarity of a blade drawn slowly from a scabbard. "Before we allow the performance to begin," Pence said, rising from his seat with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who has calculated exactly how much time he has before the world reacts. Perhaps the room deserves to hear from a man with something more than borrowed words. The silence that followed was not the silence of an empty room. It was the silence of 500 people simultaneously holding a single, collective breath. Forks were suspended over plates. Glasses were set down without sound. Somewhere in the back, a phone buzzing in a pocket was instantly suppressed. The string quartet, which had still been playing softly from behind a partition, stopped mid-phrase, as if the musicians themselves had felt the temperature drop. Pence moved toward a secondary microphone positioned near a side podium that had been set up for introductory speakers. His walk was composed, purposeful. He did not look at J.D. Vance. He looked at the room. He looked at the cameras. He was a man taking a stage he had not been invited to, and doing it with the absolute confidence of someone who believes the stage has always belonged to him. J.D. Vance had stopped walking. He stood perfectly still, his back partially to the room, his head angled slightly as if listening for something just beyond the range of normal hearing. He did not turn. He did not react. He simply became very, very still, the way still water is still, without effort, without performance, as a simple expression of its fundamental nature. The cameras swiveled. Every lens in the room, professional and personal, rotated in unison toward Mike Pence. Whatever this was, it was not on the program. J.D. Vance, Pence began, his voice now fully amplified, filling every corner of the ballroom with its careful cadence, is a man I respect. He let the word respect hang in the air just long enough for the room to register that it was not a compliment. He is disciplined. He is articulate. He is, in many ways, exactly what this party needs at this moment. But there is a difference, a profound and fundamental difference, between a man who speaks the truth and a man who speaks another man's truth, between a leader and a lieutenant, between a voice and an echo. The collective gasp was audible, not dramatic, not performative. It was the involuntary biological response of 500 people simultaneously registering that they were witnessing something they had not expected and could not quite believe. A senior senator from Georgia set down his fork so carefully it made no sound at all, and simply stared. 2 women at a donor table near the center exchanged a glance that communicated an entire conversation without a single word. The head of a major conservative think tank pressed 2 fingers to his temple and closed his eyes for exactly 1 second, as if bracing for impact. Pence's voice continued, smooth and relentless. "I have watched with great personal sadness the transformation of a man I once believed might represent the next great chapter of this movement. But what I have seen instead is not leadership. What I have seen is the perfection of a very particular kind of loyalty, the kind that does not ask questions, the kind that does not think, the kind that would follow a trumpet call off the edge of a cliff without pausing to look down. That is not strength. That is not courage. That is the biography of every political lieutenant who has ever been left holding the consequences of someone else's conviction. He paused. He let the silence work for him. He had spent 30 years in public life learning how to use silence, and he used it now with the precision of a master craftsman. J.D. Vance is not a man with a vision for this country, Pence continued, and now his voice dropped, which made it somehow more devastating. He is a man with a very refined ability to reflect someone else's. And this party, this movement, and this nation deserve more than a mirror. They deserve a man. The silence that followed those words was of a different quality than what had come before. It was not shock anymore. It was something closer to held grief, the silence of people who understood that something had just been broken and could not be fixed. Then slowly, with the deliberate, unhurried quality of a man who has never in his adult life been in a genuine hurry, because he has always understood that urgency is a form of weakness, J.D. Vance turned around. He did not look angry. He had prepared himself for many things over the course of a life that had required preparation for many things, but anger was not among his preparations tonight. What was on his face was something that the cameras struggled to capture, and the journalists in the room would spend the following days debating how to describe. It was a form of recognition, the look of a man who has anticipated something and finds, upon its arrival, that the anticipation was entirely accurate. There was calm in it. There was something close to sadness. And beneath both of those things, at a depth that only someone who had known genuine hardship could access, there was the iron quiet resolve of someone who has already decided exactly what he is going to do. He walked to the main podium, not quickly, not with the aggressive forward momentum of a man who has been challenged and is rushing to respond. He walked with the same measured, unhurried pace with which he had been walking toward it before any of this began, as if the interruption had been nothing more than a brief pause in an already decided sequence of events. He reached the podium. He adjusted the microphone. He placed his hands on either side of it, not gripping it, not white-knuckling it, just resting his hands there the way a man rests his hands on a familiar surface in his own home. He looked at Mike Pence, and the room leaned forward as one. What he said then was not a speech. It was not a prepared rejoinder. It was a question. A single question, delivered in a voice so quiet that the hundreds of people in that room had to silence not just their bodies but something deeper, something internal, in order to receive it. Mike, he said, just the name, and the use of just the name was itself a kind of statement, a declaration that whatever formal distance had existed between them was now dissolved, that they were standing not as titles but as men. Mike, you've built your entire return to public life on the claim that you stood on principle when everyone else was standing on politics. I respect a man who stands on principle. I do. But I want to ask you something. And I want you to think about it honestly. The way you'd think about it at night when no one is watching and there are no cameras and there is no applause. He paused. The room was so quiet that the ventilation system above the ceiling was audible. If your voice is the voice of principle, he said, what does it mean that the loudest applause you receive these days comes from the people who spent 4 years trying to destroy everything you claim to believe in? What does it mean that the newspapers who called your voters racists and deplorables are now calling you a hero? What does it mean, Mike, that the very enemies of this movement are the ones lining up to shake your hand? Another pause, shorter this time, a comma rather than a period. I'll tell you what it means. It means you didn't stand on principle. You stood on calculation. And the calculation was wrong, so now you're trying to dress the wreckage in the language of courage. But the people in this room, and the people watching at home who grew up the way I grew up, who have been failed and dismissed and forgotten by men exactly like the ones now congratulating you, those people can feel the difference. They've always been able to feel the difference. That's not loyalty to a man you're watching up here. That's the recognition of a truth they've been waiting a very long time to hear spoken in a room like this one. He looked at Pence directly then, and he said it quietly, without emphasis, without theater. The question isn't whether I am an echo, Mike. The question is what you became when you decided that the approval of your enemies was worth more than the loyalty of your friends. The room did not erupt. That is the wrong word for what happened. The room cracked, like ice cracks in spring, not all at once but in a spreading, irreversible fracture that you can hear in the silence between sounds. Someone in the third row drew a sharp breath. A woman near the center pressed her knuckles to her mouth. A man at a back table set down his water glass with a hand that was not entirely steady. Mike Pence's face, in the fraction of a second before he could reassemble his composure, showed something that those who were watching closely would never entirely forget. It was not anger. It was not injured dignity. It was the expression of a man who has been operating on a narrative, a carefully constructed story about himself and his choices and the meaning of what he did, and who has just heard, in public, before 500 witnesses and an unknown number of cameras, a version of that story that is more true than his own. To understand the totality of what had just happened in that room, to feel the true weight of that single question, you have to go back. You have to go back to Ohio, to the particular kind of Appalachian Ohio that most of America only encounters in news segments about economic decline or opioid statistics. You have to go back to a house where the certainties that other children take for granted, a stable morning, a consistent parent, a future that seems at least vaguely possible, were not reliable features of daily life. You have to go back to a boyhood in which J.D. Vance learned, through the accumulation of specific and indelible experiences, that the world could be very hard, that love could be complicated and incomplete and still be love, and that the only things you could truly rely on were the things you built inside yourself. His grandmother, the woman he would later write about with a directness and tenderness that surprised even the most cynical readers, was a woman of profound and sometimes violent love. She swore, she fought, she had opinions that could strip paint off walls, and she loved him with a ferocity that was the single most stabilizing force in a childhood that could easily have destroyed him. She taught him, not with words but with the daily evidence of her life, that dignity was not something granted by circumstance. It was something chosen and rechosen every single day, regardless of what circumstances said about it. The Marines had taken that understanding and forged it into something harder. 4 years of service. The structure of it, the demand of it, the particular kind of brotherhood that only exists under conditions where the stakes are genuine, all of it had given him a framework for the instincts his grandmother had planted. He had learned that loyalty was not abstract. It was specific. It had names and faces. It required things of you, real things, sometimes costly things. And the measure of a man was not whether he felt the cost but whether he paid it anyway. Yale Law School had been a different kind of education. He had walked into those hallways the way a field researcher walks into a foreign country, with the particular alertness of someone who knows that the social codes operating around them are not his own codes, and that misreading them has real consequences. He had learned the language. He had learned to move through those rooms, to sit in those seminars, to engage with those ideas, with the fluency of someone who belongs. But he had never, not for a single hour, forgotten where he came from, and more specifically, what it felt like to come from there, and to look at the world those rooms assumed as their natural backdrop, and to feel the distance between that world and your own like a physical thing, like something you carry. The book had been an act of extraordinary courage, not because it was well written, though it was, not because it told a good story, though it did, but because it required him to stand in a public square and say, "This is where I come from. This is what it looked like. This is what it felt like." And then to turn and say to the institutions and the experts and the commentators who had spent years explaining people like him to each other, "You have gotten this wrong. You have gotten the reasons wrong, and you have gotten the people wrong, and you have got the solutions wrong. And the cost of your being wrong is being paid right now by people you will never have dinner with." That book had changed things, and then something else had changed things further. He had been skeptical of Donald Trump. He had said so, publicly, in ways he later reflected on with the kind of honest self-assessment that is rare in any human being and almost unheard of in politicians. His skepticism had been the product of his education, of the intellectual framework he had acquired at Yale, of the reasonable concern that a force as disruptive and raw as Trump represented something that could damage as much as it healed. But then he had done something that his critics would never fully credit him for because it did not fit the narrative they needed. He had gone and listened, not to the media's coverage of the rallies, not to the academic analyses of the phenomenon. He had listened to the people at the rallies. He had heard the specific quality of their emotion. He had recognized it, the way you recognize a sound you've heard in a different context, at a different volume in a different room, but it is the same sound. It was the sound of people who had been told, for years, in ways both explicit and implicit, that their concerns were provincial, their values were retrograde, their communities were embarrassments to a country in the process of moving forward without them. And they were done. They were simply, finally, entirely done with being told who they were by people who had never once tried to understand them. In that recognition, J.D. Vance had made a choice. It was not a cynical choice. It was not a calculation about political advantage. It was the choice of a man who looks at a situation and sees the truth of it clearly, regardless of whether that truth is convenient or comfortable or consistent with the positions he has previously held. The truth, as he saw it, was that Donald Trump had done something that no polished, credentialed, carefully assembled establishment candidate had managed to do. He had made millions of forgotten Americans feel, for the first time in a very long time, that someone was actually fighting for them. That alone, in J.D. Vance's moral accounting, was worth a great deal. That alone was worth loyalty. Mike Pence had arrived at his own relationship with Donald Trump along a very different road. Where Vance had come from the outside and chosen to enter the movement with eyes open, Pence had been a creature of the Republican establishment who had found himself, through the particular alchemy of political timing and strategic calculation, standing on a stage beside a force that was fundamentally unlike anything his career had prepared him to understand. He had told himself a story about that relationship. He had told himself that he was the stabilizing element, the institutional ballast that kept the ship from capsizing. He had told himself that his presence was itself a form of leadership, that by standing there, by translating, by moderating, by absorbing and redirecting the most dangerous energies of the moment, he was performing an act of profound public service. And perhaps in the very beginning there had been something to that story. Perhaps in the first months, when the sheer novelty and chaos of the new administration was overwhelming the capacity of any individual to manage it, Pence's particular skill set, his ability to move through Washington with its invisible grammar and unwritten codes, had provided something genuinely useful. But over time, the story had curdled. The stabilizing element had become the compliant element. The translator had become the enabler. The man who told himself he was guiding the ship had long since realized he had no hand on the wheel, and had decided, in the silence of his own ambition, that this was acceptable as long as the ship kept moving in the direction he needed it to go. And then the ship had reached January 6th, and everything had changed. In the days following that event, Mike Pence had made a series of choices that were, each one of them, individually defensible and collectively devastating. He had chosen to receive with gratitude and apparent sincerity the praise of people who had spent 4 years treating him as a figure of mockery. He had chosen to describe his actions in the language that those people provided for him, a language of courage and constitutional fidelity that was accurate in its facts but profoundly misleading in its emotional register. He had chosen to position himself, quietly and then with increasing public confidence, as the reasonable alternative, the conservative who had passed the test that the others had failed. He had begun to believe, as powerful men often do when suddenly surrounded by a new and unexpected chorus of approval, that the chorus was right. What he had not understood, what he perhaps could not allow himself to understand because the understanding would have required too much of him, was that the millions of people who had given him their trust had watched all of this. They had watched him receive the validation of the people they believed had rigged an election. They had watched him smile for photographs with commentators who had called them dangerous. They had watched him craft a post-political persona built on the approval of an institution, the mainstream media, the establishment of both parties, the permanent class of Washington power that had made absolutely clear over and over and over again that it viewed them not as citizens to be served, but as a problem to be managed. They had watched all of it, these people. These factory workers and truck drivers and nurses and small business owners and veterans. They had watched it with the quiet, devastating attention of people who have learned, through long and painful experience, to watch very carefully what the people in power actually do, as opposed to what they say. And what they had watched Mike Pence do was leave. He had left. In the moment when they needed him to stay, to fight, to absorb the cost of standing with them rather than against them, he had constructed a narrative that made leaving look like arriving. He had made abandonment look like principle. It was this, the accumulated weight of all of this, that had brought J.D. Vance to this podium on this night. He had not come here to perform a takedown. He had not come here because the political calculus of the moment required it. He had come here because the truth, the specific and unambiguous truth of what Mike Pence had done, and what it had meant to the people who trusted him, was sitting in the room like something unsaid. And the accumulated cost of it going unsaid was more than he was willing to pay. The room was still. Pence's face had reorganized itself into something approaching composure, but it was the fragile composure of new ice, beautiful from a distance, uncertain under weight. His jaw was set. His eyes, which had moved across the room in search of something, some anchor, some sympathetic recognition, had found nothing. "I want to be clear about something," Vance said, his voice still carrying that particular quality of quiet that commands more attention than volume. "I'm not here to relitigate what happened. I'm not here to assign blame or to stoke resentment. I'm standing at this podium talking to you about this because there are millions of people who are not in this room, millions of people who are watching, millions of people who did everything that was asked of them. They voted. They knocked on doors. They put signs in their yards in neighborhoods where that sign was not welcome. They believed, with the specific and personally costly faith of people who have very little margin for error in their lives, that the men and women they sent to Washington were going to fight for them. And they deserved to hear the truth spoken plainly, by someone who is not afraid of the consequences of speaking it, in a room full of people who profit from the careful management of what gets said." He paused. He looked at Pence directly. "You came here tonight with a prepared argument. I understand that. You have been refining this argument for years now, the argument that what you did required extraordinary courage, that you faced a genuine and terrible choice and chose correctly. And I want to acknowledge that there is a version of your experience that is real. You did face a choice, but the choice was not between the Constitution and chaos. The choice was between the people who trusted you and the institutions that you decided in that moment were worth more. And you made that choice. And then you built a career on the story that made that choice look noble. But the people who were watching, the people for whom that choice had real consequences, they know what it looked like from where they were standing. And what it looked like from where they were standing was not nobility. What it looked like was the moment a man decided that his own safety and his own future and his own image in the pages of newspapers that had always despised him were worth more than the trust of millions of Americans who had given him something they very rarely give: the benefit of the doubt. The room was entirely, completely still. Not a chair shifted, not a glass was lifted. "You called me an echo," Vance said, and there was something almost gentle in his voice now, something that was the opposite of cruelty precisely because it was so honest. There was no pleasure in it. "You said I have borrowed conviction, and I want to address that directly because it matters. My conviction was not borrowed. It was built. It was built in a house where the lights sometimes went out. It was built in a school where I understood, at an age when most children are thinking about cartoons, that there are people whose job it is to make decisions about your life, and who will never, in the natural course of their own comfortable existence, encounter a life remotely similar to yours. It was built in the United States Marine Corps, where I learned that loyalty is not a sentiment. It is a practice. It is what you do on the days when the cost of it is highest. And it was built in the years since, watching this country, which I love with a fierceness that has nothing to do with politics and everything to do with the specific faces of the specific people who raised me and shaped me, Watching this country be told, by people who have never struggled, that its struggle is its own fault. His voice dropped lower. The room strained to receive it. That is not borrowed conviction, Mike. That is earned conviction, the most expensive kind. And I will not have it dismissed by a man whose primary credential for judging it is that he once stood next to someone who had it. Pence opened his mouth. It was an automatic reflex, the reflex of a man who has spent his entire adult life never being at a loss for words, who has built an identity on the reliable production of polished, persuasive language. But what came out was not polished and it was not persuasive. It was a sound, half a word, the beginning of a sentence that had no ending ready. And then silence, real silence. The silence of a man who has gone to a place inside himself and found that the place is empty. The woman in the third row, who would later be identified in news accounts as a county party chair from a state that had delivered its electoral votes by less than 11,000 votes, this woman began to clap, not enthusiastically, not with the energy of someone at a rally. She began to clap with the slow, deliberate rhythm of someone marking the truth of something. It was almost funereal in its steadiness. And then the man beside her began to clap, and then someone behind them. And it grew, not into a wave but into a tide, the kind of movement that has the quality of inevitability because it is not manufactured. It is not coordinated. It is simply the response of people who are being given permission by a single person who is willing to bear the cost of saying a true thing, to acknowledge what they have known for a long time. Mike Pence stood at the secondary microphone with the expression of a man watching his own house burn from across the street. There was nothing to do. There was nowhere to go. The fire had already taken everything. And then from the far side of the room, the doors opened. No one would be entirely able to explain afterward how exactly the arrival registered before it registered. There had been no announcement. There had been no signal from the Secret Service agents positioned near the entry. Their posture had not changed. Their earpieces had not crackled with audible instructions. And yet somehow, the room knew. The knowing moved through the assembled 500 like a current through water, table by table, person by person, until every head had turned, and every eye was fixed on the open doors at the far end of the federal Capitol ballroom. Donald Trump walked in the way he always walked into rooms, not with the manufactured drama of a theatrical entrance, with something more primal, more fundamental, the quality of presence that certain rare individuals carry, that has nothing to do with height or volume or even reputation, that is simply the result of a human being who has never once in their adult life doubted whether they belonged in the room they were entering. He was wearing a dark suit. His tie was a deep crimson. He moved with the particular kind of slowness that communicates not leisure but control, the deliberate pace of a man who has decided the universe can wait. He did not look at the crowd at first. He looked at the stage. He looked at the two figures positioned there, the vice president still behind the podium, the former vice president standing at the secondary microphone with the particular stillness of a man who has run out of moves. Trump read the room in approximately 3 seconds, the way a general reads terrain. Then, and only then, he began to walk down the center aisle. People stood as he passed. Not all of them. Not immediately. But the standing spread, the way standing always spreads in the presence of something that carries weight, person by person, like dominoes falling in slow motion. A donor from Houston was on his feet before he fully understood he had decided to stand. A senator from a coastal state who had spent the past 2 years carefully cultivating a public image of principled independence found himself rising before he could reason himself out of it. The pull was not political. It was something older. J.D. Vance had turned from the room and was watching Trump's approach with an expression of composed deference. Not relief, not triumph, deference. The expression of a man who understands with both clarity and peace his place in a larger order of things. He stepped back from the center of the podium without being asked. The movement was so natural, so unconflicted, that no one in the room could have identified the precise moment it happened. 1 second Vance commanded the center of the stage. The next, that center had been vacated, waiting. Mike Pence had not moved. He appeared for a moment to be genuinely incapable of moving. His eyes tracked Trump's progress down the aisle with an expression that might have been described, in another context, as watching an approaching verdict. The muscles of his face were working, subtle and involuntary, the face trying to reassemble itself into something, any recognizable expression that might serve as a shield. Finding none adequate to the moment, it simply went still. A stillness that was not peace, but the absence of options. Trump reached the stage. He stepped up. He did not hurry. He walked to the podium and placed both hands on it in a gesture that was entirely familiar, entirely his, a gesture he had made at 1,000 podiums over a decade of public life. He looked out at the room for a long moment. His gaze swept across it with a thoroughness that was itself a statement. He was not looking for approval. He was looking at what was there. Then he looked at Mike Pence. The look was not the look of a man who has prepared a speech. It was the look of a man who has something specific to say and is deciding, in real time, precisely how to say it. It lasted perhaps 4 seconds. To Pence, it was evident from the way his shoulders drew slightly in on themselves. It felt much longer. "You know," Trump said, his voice at a conversational volume that the microphone delivered to every corner of the room, his voice carrying the particular quality of authenticity that comes from a man who has never in his life been afflicted with the desire to sound like someone other than himself. "You know, I've seen a lot of things in a lot of rooms over a lot of years. I've seen deals fall apart and deals come together. I've seen people who I thought were strong turn out to be something else. And I've seen people who nobody expected much from turn out to be exactly what was needed when it was needed. You develop a sense for it over time. You learn to read people." He paused. His gaze had not left Pence's face. "I was watching tonight from back there," he said, with a slight backward tilt of his head, "and I want to say something very clearly to everyone in this room and to everyone watching. What J.D. Vance did tonight is not something you can teach a person. You can teach someone to give a speech. You can hire the best people, the most brilliant people to write the words. You can train someone to stand in a certain way and project in a certain way and time their pauses in a certain way. But you cannot teach a person to mean what they say with their whole body, their whole history, the whole weight of a life that has asked things of them and not always offered easy answers. That is something that is either there or it isn't. And tonight this room got to see it." He turned slightly, so that his body was angled toward J.D. Vance, his gaze still resting on the broader room. "I picked J.D. Vance because I know how to look at people, not at their resumes, not at who they know or what schools they went to or how their hair looks on television. I look at what they're made of when things get uncomfortable, when the easy thing and the right thing are different things and somebody has to choose. That's the only test that matters. And tonight, everyone in this room and everyone watching at home got to see what J.D. Vance is made of." Then he turned to look directly at Pence again, and the quality of his gaze changed. Not hostile, not vengeful, something older and sadder than either of those things. "Mike," he said, the name alone, in the same register that Vance had used it, carrying the weight of a complicated history stripped of formality. "I gave you the second highest office in the world. I trusted you with things I trusted very few people with. And I'm going to say something tonight that I probably should have said a long time ago, because saying it clearly is the only thing that is fair to the people in this room, and to the people watching, the people whose trust you had." The room had achieved a quality of silence that seemed to have physical properties, a silence you could feel on your skin. "You didn't leave because of the Constitution, Mike. The Constitution was the language you chose, and I understand why. It's a good language for the purpose. Clean, authoritative, hard to argue with. But the truth that I think you know and that these people know even if they've never articulated it exactly this way, the truth is that you left because you decided it was time to leave. You decided that the cost was too high, and maybe that's a human decision. Maybe there's not a person in this room who, in their most honest private moment, can say they never made a calculation that prioritized their own future over something harder. But the difference is that most of those people didn't ask millions of Americans to believe they were doing otherwise. You asked them to believe you were standing on principle. And then you cashed that claim in for speaking fees and editorial praise from the people who have always despised everything you claim to stand for." Pence's face had gone beyond pale. There was a grayness to it now, the colorlessness of a man in genuine shock. "The people in this country," Trump continued, his voice dropping to something quieter, something that contained within it the specific gravity of a man who has, over the course of his public life, learned more about betrayal than most people ever have to. The people in this country who believed in you, who prayed for you, who stood in lines for hours in the rain and cold and heat to vote for a ticket that had your name on it. Those people didn't deserve to have their faith treated as a political asset to be liquidated at the strategically optimal moment. And they deserved to have someone say that out loud. Tonight, someone did. He placed a hand on J.D. Vance's shoulder. The gesture was brief and untheatrical. It was the gesture of a man who means what he is doing. This man, Trump said simply, is the future. Not because I say so, because he proved it tonight with what he said and how he said it and what it cost him to say it. The future belongs to the people who are willing to pay the cost of truth. And this country still has more of those people than it has of the other kind. The silence held for exactly the length of a breath, and then the room broke open. It was not the coordinated applause of a rally. It was not the polite, rhythmic approval of a fundraiser crowd demonstrating its sophistication. It was the sound that a room full of people makes when they have been holding something in their bodies, tension and grief and hope, and the specific ache of feeling unseen for too long, and are suddenly given permission to let it go. It rose from the floor of the ballroom in a wave that was not organized and not performed, and could not have been manufactured under any conditions. It was the realest sound in the room. It had been the realest sound in the room since the evening began. Mike Pence stood in that sound the way a man stands in a storm he cannot shelter from. He did not crumble. He was too practiced in the management of public self for crumbling. But something behind his eyes went out. Some pilot light, some small, persistent flame of hope that he had carried all evening, the hope that there was still some argument to be made, some appeal to be lodged, some thread of the evening that could be pulled back toward him, went out. And what was left was the face of a man who understands, fully and finally, that it is over. J.D. Vance did not watch Pence in that moment. He was looking at the room, at the faces, at the woman in the third row who was crying with the quiet, released tears of someone who has waited a very long time to see a specific thing happen. At the older veteran near the aisle who was standing at a kind of attention that had nothing to do with formality and everything to do with instinct. At the young couple near the back who had driven 4 hours to attend this event, and who were now holding each other's hands in the wordless way of people who have just witnessed something they want to remember. He was looking at them, and what he felt, standing there at that podium with the weight of the room pressing in on him from all sides, was not triumph. He had anticipated that it might feel like triumph, and he had been uncertain about that anticipation in the days leading up to tonight, uncertain whether that feeling would be acceptable to him. But it was not triumph. It was closer to the feeling after a hard and necessary conversation, the specific exhaust of a person who has said something true that needed saying, knowing full well that the saying of it was going to cost something, and having said it anyway. He leaned back into the microphone. "I want to say one more thing," he said. The room did not entirely quiet, but it quieted enough. "There is something I want to say to the people at home, the people who are not here in this room, who do not have seats at tables like these. The people who have been watching this from living rooms in places that do not often get mentioned in conversations about the future of the Republican Party. I want to say this directly to you, because you are the reason I came here tonight. Not to settle a score. Not to perform. You are the reason." He paused. He looked directly into the camera that was straight ahead of him, the one whose red light indicated it was live. "You have been told, for years, that the way you see the world is simple, that your instincts are unsophisticated, that your loyalty is misplaced, that your anger is misguided, and your hope is naive. You have been told this by people who make very comfortable livings in very comfortable places, explaining to each other why the concerns of people like you are not really the kind of concerns that serious policy should take seriously. And you have watched your leaders, some of them, not all of them, but some of the most prominent ones, come to agree with that explanation. You have watched them drift, incrementally and then decisively, toward the places and people and institutions that have always regarded your world with a combination of pity and contempt. And you have watched them describe that drift as growth, as maturity, as the courage to face hard truths. His voice, still quiet, had taken on a texture that was harder to name. Not anger. Something more like grief, the grief of someone who has watched something precious be diminished by people who did not understand its value. What I want to tell you tonight is that your instincts were right. Your sense that something was wrong was not paranoia. Your sense that the people who claimed to speak for you were managing you rather than representing you was not bitterness. It was accurate. It was the accuracy of people who have spent their lives being forced to read between the lines because the lines themselves were written by people who didn't want to say plainly what they meant. You are not simple. You are not naive. You see things that are very clear and that a great deal of wealth and institutional power have been deployed to obscure. And tonight I am standing in front of you, in front of all of these cameras, and I am telling you that what you saw was real and what you felt was justified, and that the only thing left to figure out is what we do about it together. The room was very still. The quality of the stillness had changed again, shifting from the stunned paralysis of early in the evening to something more like the stillness of a congregation in the moment after a hard truth has been spoken from a pulpit. The kind of stillness in which every individual is processing privately, but the processing is somehow shared. Somewhere in the third row, a woman who had spent the last 2 years telling herself that she was overreacting, that her sense of having been abandoned by the political structures she had invested in was melodrama rather than reality, was crying in the specific and private way of a person who has been given, unexpectedly and in a public place, a moment of being seen. She was not crying because of anything theatrical. She was crying because the man at the podium had described her experience accurately, and she had not expected that, and the unexpected accuracy of it had broken through something that she had kept careful control of for a long time. At the back of the room, two journalists who had arrived that evening expecting a standard fundraiser speech and the opportunity to file a perfunctory 1,200 words by 10 o'clock were typing with an urgency that had nothing to do with deadline pressure. One of them paused in her typing, looked up at the stage, and then typed something that was not a quote and not a fact but a single word of personal notation in her document. The word was real. She stared at it for a second and then continued filing. Mike Pence had moved. At some point in the moments after Trump's remarks, he had taken several steps toward the edge of the stage in the direction of the wings. He had not announced this movement. He had not been escorted. He had simply begun the slow, quiet dissolution of his presence from the center of events. A staff member, one of the event organizers, had gently guided him toward a chair at the far right edge of the front row below the stage. He sat in it with the careful, deliberate movements of a man managing a body that is responding to something the mind has not fully integrated. He sat very straight. He folded his hands on the table in front of him. He looked at his hands. He was still sitting there an hour later when the formal portion of the evening concluded, and the room began the slow process of emptying. By then, the conversations happening around him had moved on, as they always do, to the next thing. The implications, the analysis, the strategic calculations about what this meant for the future of various candidacies and coalitions. The room was already metabolizing the evening into something that could be managed and categorized and made useful. That is what this particular class of people does with extraordinary events. It is their professional skill and perhaps their professional necessity. But Pence sat in his chair and looked at his hands, and what he was doing was not analysis. What he was doing was something quieter and more private. He was reckoning. He was moving backward through the years, through the choices, through the specific moments that had accumulated into the situation in which he now found himself. He was looking for the place where the road had forked. He was looking for the decision that had set everything else in motion. He found many candidates, and none of them felt sufficient to explain the whole of it. The truth, which he was perhaps approaching for the first time with something approaching genuine honesty, was that there had been no single fork in the road. There had been a long series of small accommodations, each one defensible in isolation, each one adding its small weight to a trajectory that had, in aggregate, carried him somewhere he had not intended to go. That is how most of the real disasters happen, in lives and in politics. Not in the moment of the dramatic choice, but in the accumulation of the small ones. The places where you tell yourself you are being strategic when you are actually being afraid. The moments when you describe your caution as principle and your retreat as wisdom. The years in which the story you tell about yourself and the story that is actually being lived diverge by millimeters at first and then by miles. He was still sitting there when one of his remaining staff members, a young man who had stayed with him out of a combination of loyalty and the practical reality that no other position was immediately available, approached and asked quietly if he was ready to go. Pence looked up. The young man's expression was carefully neutral. He was doing his job, performing the small, necessary functions of support that remain performable, and his neutrality was an act of professional kindness. Pence stood. He buttoned his jacket. The gesture was automatic. He looked once more at the stage, empty now, the podium still holding the microphone at its adjusted height. The room was mostly empty. The chandeliers still burned overhead, making light for a space that no longer needed it. He walked out through the side exit. No cameras followed him. No reporters caught up with him in the corridor. The security detail that had accompanied him into the event had contracted, as was procedure, and the exit was managed quietly and without ceremony. He walked through a service corridor that smelled of warming trays and fresh linen, past kitchen workers who did not look up from their work, and out through a door that opened onto an alley where two black vehicles were waiting. He got into the car. The door closed. The car pulled out of the alley into the quiet street. He did not speak to the aide in the front seat. He looked out the window at the lights of the city, which had not changed, and which did not appear to have been informed that anything significant had happened. Inside the ballroom, J.D. Vance was surrounded, not by the political operatives and donors who usually surround people of his position, though they were there too, circling at a respectful distance, waiting their turn. He was surrounded by the people who had waited, quietly, without pushing, without the urgency of people who believe their time is valuable and must not be wasted. They had waited in a loose, patient line, and they were making their way to him one by one, and what they were doing was not networking. It was the opposite of networking. It was the unmanaged, unstrategic communication of people who simply needed to tell someone something. A woman who ran a daycare in West Virginia, a retired police officer from the Pittsburgh suburbs, a man who had served 3 tours in Iraq and was now having difficulty with his VA benefits and who wanted, more than anything, to simply say to a person in power that the difficulty was real. A small business owner from Michigan who had reopened twice after closures and was not certain she could do it a third time. They came to him with the specific quality of people who have not been in the habit of expecting anyone in a room like this one to be interested in what they had to say, and who are managing, with the characteristic caution of that experience, the possibility that the expectation might be wrong. J.D. Vance talked to all of them. He did not rush. He did not manage. He listened in the way he had always listened, with the slight forward incline of his head that communicated genuine attention, that said without words that whatever you were saying was the only thing that mattered in that precise moment. He asked questions, real questions, the specific, curious, informed questions of a man who has been thinking about the answers for a long time and is genuinely interested in new information about them. The aide, who would later write a brief account of the evening in her personal journal, noted that he looked, in those conversations, like a man who had been given something he needed more than he had known he needed it. He looked like a man being filled up rather than drained. That was the precise word she wrote. Filled. She had been working in politics for 6 years and had watched many politicians interact with the people who had voted for them, and she could not remember the last time she had used that word. Outside the building, the news cycle was moving at the speed it moves at now, which is the speed of light filtered through the specific urgency of platforms that reward intensity over accuracy. The clip of Vance's question to Pence was the most viewed piece of video in the country within 40 minutes of its first upload. The clip of Trump's arrival and subsequent remarks was the second most viewed. The clip of Pence's initial attack, rendered now in the light of everything that had followed it, was being replayed with the quality of footage that already feels historical, already feels like documentation of a moment that will be referred back to for a long time. The commentary was divided along the lines that commentary on anything in this era divides along. On one side, the interpretation that what Vance had done was calculated political theater, a skilled performance of authenticity, a masterclass in the manipulation of genuinely held emotion for strategic ends. On the other, the counterinterpretation that the performance theory, which had become the default sophisticated explanation for anything a certain class of political figure did, was itself a defensive mechanism, a way of maintaining the comfortable certainty that nothing was ever actually real, that everyone in public life was always performing, that the appropriate response to apparent sincerity was the assumption of its absence. What neither interpretation could account for, because neither had a framework for accounting for it, was the specific quality of the response from the people who had watched the evening unfold, not from the pundits, not from the commentators or the political scientists or the journalists who covered these events as professionals, from the people who had watched it from their living rooms and diners and church basements, the people for whom this was not a political story but a personal one, the people whose reaction was not analysis but recognition. A man named Robert Harriwell in Columbus, Ohio, who had worked at the same automotive parts plant for 22 years and who had voted in every election since he turned 18, watched the clip of J.D. Vance's question to Mike Pence 3 times on his phone in the parking lot of a supermarket, sitting in his truck, not going inside. He watched it a 4th time. Then he put his phone in his pocket and sat for a moment in the particular stillness of a person who has been surprised by something they didn't know they were waiting for. Then he went inside to do his shopping, and as he moved through the fluorescent aisles of the store, he found himself thinking about his father, who had died 5 years earlier, who had worked in a different plant in a different city for a different number of years, and who had, in the last years of his life, expressed with increasing plainness a feeling of having been forgotten by the country he had spent his working life building things for. He had not had language for it. He had had feelings and instincts, and a general and growing sense that the distance between the people who ran things and the people who made things was not just economic but moral, was not just a question of money but of regard, of whether you were seen as a full and equal participant in the national story or as a backdrop for other people's stories about themselves. Robert Harriwell had not been able to explain this to his wife, and he had not been able to explain it to his coworkers, and he had certainly not been able to explain it to the man at the union meeting who had kept talking about collective bargaining agreements with the fervent focus of someone who has decided that the specific mechanism is the point. But he had understood it about his father. He had understood it wordlessly and thoroughly. And watching J.D. Vance speak tonight, he found himself thinking that the man at the podium had somehow, without ever having met his father and without ever having had the specific conversation, understood it too, and had said so, in a room full of powerful people, in front of cameras, without flinching. He called his daughter on the way home. She was 23 and lived in a different city and had views that were somewhat different from his own, and they had been working, in the deliberate and gentle way of people who love each other and are trying to maintain the love across significant disagreement, on how to talk to each other about the things that mattered. He did not call to talk about politics. He called to tell her he was thinking about her grandfather. She asked why, and he said he had just seen something on the news that reminded him of him. She asked what he had seen, and he said a man who talked the way your grandfather talked, like he meant it. She was quiet for a moment, and then said that sounded like a good thing, and he said, "Yeah, I think it is." And they talked for 40 minutes about things other than politics, and the conversation was very good. This is the thing that does not appear in the political analyses and the clip compilations and the evening's omniscient and accelerating coverage. The conversations that happened between the moment the evening ended and the morning of the following day. The phone calls, the late-night texts, the quiet exchanges between people who watch these things not as political events but as signals, as readings of something deeper and less easily named than approval ratings or primary polling, or the shifting balance of power within a party. In a small apartment in eastern Pennsylvania, a woman named Delia Corin, who had not voted in the last 2 election cycles because she had come to believe that the effort was not worth the consequence, that the people she sent to Washington simply did not operate according to any logic that bore a meaningful relationship to the world she lived in. Sat up until 2 in the morning watching the full footage of the evening's events on her laptop. She watched it twice. She did not cry. She did not call anyone. She sat in her kitchen with a cup of tea that went cold and thought about something her mother had said to her once, that the worst thing that could happen to a democracy was not the election of bad people but the exhaustion of good ones. Her mother had died 3 years before. She thought about calling her brother, who still voted and who she had argued with about it, but it was late. She went to bed. In the morning, she looked up how to register to vote in her county. She did not do this because of a speech. She did not do it because she had been persuaded by rhetoric. She did it because she had watched a man stand in a room where the cost of standing was high and do it anyway, and the watching of it had reminded her of something that she had allowed herself to forget, which was that the cost of not standing was also high, just slower, just less visible, just more easily explained away as something other than what it was. These are the stories that don't fit the frameworks. These are the things that happened in the spaces between the coverage, in the private hours of ordinary people who were trying to make sense of what they had seen, using the only tools available to them, which were their own experience and their own instincts, and the specific weight of lives that had asked things of them, and not always provided easy answers. The morning following the gala brought with it the particular quality of a morning that knows it is the morning after something. The light over Washington had the quality of light after a night of heavy weather, clarified and sharpened by whatever had passed through. The streets were the same streets. The buildings were the same buildings. But the people moving through them were moving through a world in which certain things had been said that could not be unsaid, and certain things had been seen that could not be unseen. J.D. Vance was in his office before 8. He was reading, which was his habit at that hour, and which he found necessary not as a performance of diligence, but as a genuine requirement of the kind of thinking he needed to do, the reading of material that had nothing to do with the immediate concerns of the day, that gave him access to ideas and frameworks that were not generated by the relentless specificity of political life. He was reading a biography of a figure he had long admired when his chief of staff knocked and entered with the day's first briefing. The folder's implications were already being processed, she told him. The contents, which had been provided to major outlets overnight by appropriate channels, were being reported across every significant media platform. The coverage was, as could be expected, divided. Some outlets were treating the revelation as explosive, as documentation of exactly the kind of political cynicism that Vance had described at the podium. Others were applying the requisite skepticism, questioning the sourcing, the context, the legitimacy of the declassification process. This was predictable and was predicted and required no special response. The truth tends to find its level. It does not always find it quickly, but it finds it. What was less predictable was the volume and the quality of the response coming from outside the political class. The emails and letters and phone calls arriving at the office were not primarily from operatives or strategists or the professional community of people who live inside this world. They were from the other category, the people who do not operate within these structures but who watch them from the outside with the attentive, often resigned awareness of citizens who understand that what happens in these rooms has consequences for their lives, even when those rooms make no effort to acknowledge their existence. The response from that category was notable, not for its volume, though the volume was significant, for its register. The people writing and calling were not primarily expressing political enthusiasm. They were expressing something that took a moment to identify correctly but which, once identified, was unmistakable. They were expressing relief, the specific, measured relief of people who had been waiting to see whether someone would say a particular thing in a particular way, in a room where it would actually be heard, and who had begun to accommodate themselves to the possibility that this would not happen, and who now found that it had. He received all of this information from his chief of staff, who delivered it with the professional compression of someone presenting a situation report. He asked several clarifying questions. He noted several responses that should be made. He thanked her. And then, when she had gone, He sat for a moment in the particular quiet of a morning office, with the sounds of the building coming to life around him, the footsteps in the corridor, the distant phones, the muffled conversations, and he thought about a specific conversation he had had with his grandmother years ago, when he was still young enough to sit in her kitchen without the self-consciousness that comes with age, and with the distance that education puts between a person and their origins. She had been talking about something that had happened to someone in the neighborhood. He could not remember the specific details. What he remembered was what she had said about it afterward. She had said, "The hardest thing is not doing the right thing. The hardest thing is doing the right thing and then living with what it costs, because the doing is over in a moment, but the living goes on." And then she had looked at him with that particular directness that she deployed with such specific and devastating effectiveness, that made you feel that she was looking at something inside you that you were not entirely certain you had yet. And she had said, "The people worth knowing are the ones who pay anyway. They pay even when they know what it's going to cost them. Those are your people. The rest are just passing through." He had not thought about that conversation in years. He thought about it now, in the quiet of the morning, in the very particular room of the building of the institution of the position he occupied. He thought about it, and then he opened the next document in the briefing folder and continued the work of the day. The day had its full schedule, meetings and briefings and the specific bureaucratic weight of governance, which is the most important and least narratively satisfying reality of any position of actual power. The things that matter most in governance do not happen in ballrooms. They happen in conference rooms and on phone calls, and in the long, careful reading of documents that are not written for an audience, and in the slow, unglamorous accumulation of expertise and relationship and institutional knowledge that is the actual substance of public life behind the drama that the public sees. He worked through the day with the same quality of attention that characterized all of his work, the focused, specific attention of someone who understands that the details matter, that the thing that will actually affect the lives of the people he works for is almost never the thing that makes the news, that the news is the visible surface of an ocean whose depth is where the real work happens and where the real consequences are made. In the late afternoon, there was a break in the schedule. His aide had arranged it. He used it to call his wife. The conversation was private and had nothing to do with anything that had happened the previous evening in any political sense. It had to do with the children, and with a trip they were planning, and with a small logistical complication that required their joint attention. The conversation was entirely ordinary. It was one of the best parts of the day. Toward evening, a handwritten note arrived by messenger. The handwriting on the outside of the envelope was that of a very elderly person, careful and slightly unsteady in a way that communicates not weakness, but the concentration of someone for whom the act of writing has become deliberate. He opened it. Inside, on a single sheet of cream-colored paper, was a message from a man who identified himself as a retired schoolteacher from Central Ohio, 78 years old, who said he had voted in every presidential election since 1968, and who said he had watched the previous evening's events with his wife on their television in the living room of the house they had lived in for 51 years, and who wanted to say one thing. He said, "I was a teacher for 34 years. In all that time, the thing I was trying to teach, more than any subject, was what it means to be honest in a world that rewards the opposite. Most of the time, I did not know if I was getting through. Most of the time, the thing you most want to give young people is the thing hardest to verify whether they have received. But last night, watching you, I felt the way I used to feel on the rare occasions when I knew, with certainty, that I had gotten through. Whatever it cost you to say what you said, the way you said it was the right cost for the right thing. I wanted you to know that a retired teacher in Ohio is glad you exist. That's all. Forgive the old-fashioned letter. My wife says I should use the email, but I have never trusted it with anything that matters." He read the letter twice. He folded it carefully along its original creases. He placed it in the inside pocket of his suit jacket, against his chest, where he would carry it for the rest of the day, a small, private anchor against the weight of everything else. The evening brought one final encounter, a reception, smaller and less formal than the previous night's event, where he was expected to spend some time with a group of legislators from several states who were visiting Washington for a series of meetings. He moved through the reception with his customary combination of patience and genuine interest, the quality of attention he gave to people that made them feel the attention was real because it was. Near the end of the reception, a young man of perhaps 25 years old, who was serving as a junior aide to one of the visiting legislators, managed to catch a moment of his time. The young man was from Kentucky. He was visibly nervous in a way that was touching rather than annoying, the nervousness of someone for whom this kind of proximity to power is not yet familiar and who has not yet developed the performance of ease that makes most people in these environments difficult to distinguish from each other. The young man said he was sorry to take his time. He said he had grown up in eastern Kentucky, in a county that had seen better days, and that he had watched the previous evening on his phone in his apartment, and that he wanted to say, if it was appropriate to say this, that he had recognized something. Not in any political way, in a deeper way. He said he had recognized in what Vance had said last night something that he had never been able to articulate about his own experience, and the experience of the people he had grown up with. The specific combination of pride and frustration and love and grief that constitutes the emotional reality of being from a place that the national story has assigned to the category of the left behind. He said he was in politics because he wanted to do something about that. He said he was not always certain that he was in the right place to do it. He said that last night had reminded him that he was. Vance listened to all of this without interrupting. Then he said, "That feeling of not being sure you're in the right place to do the right thing, that's the feeling you should trust. The people who are always certain they're in exactly the right place to do exactly the right thing are the ones you have to watch. The uncertainty means you're paying attention. Keep paying attention." The young man nodded. He said thank you. He stepped back into the reception. Vance moved on to the next conversation. Later that night, in the quiet of his home, after the children were asleep, and the day had finally concluded its long and demanding arc, he sat for a while in the kitchen with a cup of tea and a pad of paper on which he was not writing anything, but which he had placed in front of him out of the habit of a person who thinks better when there is the possibility of writing. He thought about the letter from the retired teacher. He thought about the young man from Kentucky. He thought about his grandmother in her kitchen, about what she had said about people who pay anyway. He thought about the room the night before, and the quality of the silence when the question landed, and the faces he had seen in the crowd, and the specific grief on Mike Pence's face at the moment when the mask had gone. He did not think about this with triumph. He did not think about it with satisfaction. He thought about it with the particular seriousness of someone who understands that what happened in that room was not a victory, but a responsibility. That the people who had responded to what he had said were not simply approving of a performance. They were extending a trust, the same trust they had extended before, to other people in other rooms and had been failed by. They were extending it again because they needed to, because the alternative was the exhaustion his mother had warned against, the slow capitulation of people who have been failed enough times that they stop expecting anything different. He did not intend to fail them. That was not a political commitment. It was not a campaign promise. It was the kind of intention that does not require articulation, because it does not operate at the level of language. It operates at the level of the choices you make when the easy thing and the right thing are different things and somebody has to choose. He picked up the pad of paper. He wrote a single sentence on it. Then he put the pen down and sat with the sentence for a while, and then he went to bed. The sentence was, "The work begins." If this story moved you, if it spoke to something you believe in about truth and courage and the kind of leadership this country deserves, please like this video. Share it with someone who has started to lose faith. Subscribe to this channel if you want to stay close to the stories that matter, the ones happening in the rooms and the living rooms and the quiet kitchens of a nation that is still, against all evidence, trying to find its way back to something real. Because the truth is a disinfectant, and the light is still ours to turn on.